The Vino Geek Podcast, wine from a Kiwi perspective. Welcome back to the Vino Geek Podcast. This week I feel truly blessed and privileged to be able to present this episode, this very special episode of the podcast to you. I dive into the special life of Peter Taylor, the founder of Scenic Cellars, and his lasting legacy on the New Zealand wine industry and how he helped mould and shape this. This is coming to on the day that Webb's is actually having their live auction of the best of Peter Taylor's eclectic cellar that he sadly left. And so they have auctioned most of it. They saved the very best for a special dinner, and that's actually happening tonight as this has been released. And I have to give a very big thank you to Emma Jenkins, Master of Wine, Tony Bish, winemaker of Tony Bish Wines, Daniel Kemp, owner of Great Little Vineyards, and Ian Isaacs, formerly an owner of Scenic Cellars, that helped made this episode possible. So, yeah, big shout out to them. An exciting episode, and all I can say is let's get into it. It's going to be, I'll explain. It's going to be a little collection of them talking about Peter. I will have a little spiel of mine. I mean, I wasn't blessed to really have a professional relationship with Peter Taylor as such. I did know him, and I respected and admired everything that he achieved when he had Scenic Cellars. Me being an ex-employee of Scenic Cellars post him, it was always a wait to make sure that the range, lived up to the standard that he set. It was difficult, it was a very difficult thing to do. But I hoped I did do it justice in the environment that was Scenic Cellars at the time I was there. So, enough said, let's get into the episode. Just taking a quick pause in the episode to remind you to like, subscribe, comment, and come and follow me on socials too. So for me, Peter has always been someone I respected and admired, for what he created. The fact that he was basically the first person to bring a fine wine of the world to New Zealand and introduce it to Kiwis. And, didn't matter. If you knew wine, you knew of Scenic Cellars. And as I mentioned in the intro, it was a big weight on my shoulders, to know that I had to keep up standards. That's my opinion. I felt like I had to keep up the standards that Peter Taylor set, and then everybody subsequently had kept. And you'll hear Emma touch on that later, and even when I read out the little message from Ian, same sort of thing. You'll hear the passion and the drive and the desire to have the best wines. Makes it difficult as someone like myself to step into those shoes and be the one ranging the wines at Scenic Cellars, albeit different business models. So I had to work in around those parameters as well as try and deliver that. Left a big impression on me, because obviously the legacy that Scenic Cellars held and still holds. Unfortunately, nowadays it's very much just a part of a business rather than the business, but that's what happens, and still very blessed that that's been part of the New Zealand wine industry. So if you never met Peter, or you have never, you never got to experience Scenic Cellars in its heyday, as I said, I wasn't a customer of Scenic Cellars when Peter owned it, but I got to experience his legacy anyway before, so I knew when I stepped into the role I had what I was stepping into and how I had to be the person and deliver the things that I had to deliver. So that's, and over the years, Peter would go to shows, and after he had long retired, and I was the wine buyer at Scenic, and he'd come in with this list of wines that he had tried at the wine awards dinners and saying, I want this, and it'll be literally 6 bottles of this and 6 bottles of that, which, it's cool, but it can be painful when you've got a list a mile long of all these things you have to do, and then you have to try and source these wines from producers you have no contact with whatsoever. So it can be, it was difficult at times, but still it was a challenge that in hindsight I am blessed and privileged to have to do, because I was sourcing wines for Peter Taylor. That's a rare and special privilege. At the time I didn't really feel like that, but in hindsight I look back at it and it was a blessing. One thing I have to mention, I actually would have loved to have Peter on the podcast, but sadly, obviously, never got that opportunity. So this is the next best thing, to have people talking about Peter and sharing their experiences with Peter, which is, such a blessing. And I thank them in the intro, but I have to thank them again, because without them contributing to this episode isn't possible. Yeah. Being said, we'll move on to the first of our contributors. Now, I didn't really know how to mix this up and present this, but I've decided to go with Emma Jenkins first. Those of you who don't know her, she is the first female winemaker in New Zealand. She was a former employee of Peter and someone that really looked to Peter as an inspiration and a driving force in her becoming what she has and having the life and wine that she does have. So just in a minute you'll hear a clip of her talking about that. That's coming up.
Hi, Grant. Thanks so much for the opportunity to have a chat about Peter Taylor and Scenic Cellars. I'm so pleased you're doing this. He was a really, really fantastic guy, and he was, an incredibly important guy in the wine trade, but also a really seminal influence in many people's lives. He's certainly the reason that I've ended up working in wine. Really, really great that you are doing this. I worked for Peter Taylor at the end of 1999, which is I'd just finished my uni degree in science down at Otago, and I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to be doing, whether I wanted to go back down to Otago to do postgraduate stuff or go to Auckland, and I got a job at Scenic Cellars, and it obviously changed the trajectory of my life, really. I fell in love with wine, and it was just the most magical place to work, and there's no doubt that so much of that was about the environment that Peter had created there. The place was it was a kind of a wine wonderland, really. There was everything was there. There were, it didn't really matter whether you wanted something super fancy like DRC or a phenomenal collection of Bordeaux and Champagne, all of the classics were there. But also you could just find, I guess, the weird and the wonderful of the wine world. So stuff that people now would maybe think is commonplace. wines from the Jura and kind of smaller producers from the Loire and things like that. But back then, that sort of stuff was quite hard to find, and you could come into Scenic Cellars and just everything was there. So if if you were passionate about wine, or if you were like I was, starting to fall in love with wine and wanting to learn more, there was just no better place to be. It'd be fair to say, Peter was a real character. He wasn't always the easiest person to work for. I do remember there was one day I was like, nope, no, he's not going to make me cry, because I'd been, given a decent serve for something I'd done, which was stupid, and it was fair enough. But Peter had a pretty old school approach to work life. But he had the most incredible work ethic himself. The energy that he had was phenomenal, and that was kind of infectious. And so, even if you did do something dumb or hadn't pulled your socks up or whatever, my approach was just took it on the chin and learn from that. He was a great person to watch as a boss, but also just to learn from as a human, because there were no excuses. His favorite thing was if you did something stupid, you'd be, down the bush working. What did he say? He used to say you'd be down the bush working with a chainsaw, which obviously, was probably not likely something that I was ever going to end up doing. But I got the message, which was, sort yourself out and get on with it. But he was also great, because if you were interested in wine and you worked hard, and he would support that, and he was really encouraging of that. He loved to see that people were interested in wine. I mean, he thought obviously it made sense from a sales point of view to encourage people to do that, but also, as someone who loved wine himself, I think he really liked seeing that in other people, and he was really encouraging of that. And so, he not only was he always opening up amazing wines to taste of everything. Peter was not somebody who had any thoughts of airs and graces about anything, I don't think, and he took that approach to wine too. So he was just as interested in a new producer from somewhere that was coming through from New Zealand to, the kind of the illustrious names of the old world. But, he would encourage you to taste these wines, to drink these wines, to talk about these wines. We had a great staff education program with lots of tastings. He had, there were all the books were there, subscribed to all the magazines. So it was just a great place to soak up knowledge and to really immerse yourself. I think, I worked there, as I said, from 1999, and I left, I think it was 2006, and Peter had retired. I can't remember now if it was 04 or 05, but those early years, I mean, it actually slightly shocking to think how long ago that was now. My God, 26 years ago I started. But it's, the wine trade was a different sort of a place then as well. It's quite of crazy to think, because a lot of the people who we're still, getting amazing wines from now, were involved, but it was really early days in many ways. Like, Warren and Lorraine at Balancha had just started their label. Tony Bish was still, he was involved at Sacred Hill. A lot of the Central Otago people, there were very few labels that were there. There was things like Ripon and Chard Farm, and Gibston were there, but, there was Kawara Estate, Olson's, lots of names, William, oh my goodness, now I've forgotten the name, and Alex, Verden Burgess's place. All of those ones, which sadly, that they're not there anymore, although in some cases the vineyards are, thankfully. But it was a real sort of, not a starting out point, but I guess it was a build of, of when the critical mass was starting to happen. So it was an exciting time to be in the wine trade, and Scenic was really at the forefront of all of that, as well as being a substantial bricks and mortar shop. Peter had built up a mailing list of over 20,000 people when I first started working there, and that was all done by hand. It was sort of, I mean, this is really making me sound old now. Obviously the internet existed, but it wasn't like an online mailing thing. That was slowly transitioning while I was there. But this was, we had a gaggle of old ladies, probably my age now, who used to come in, and the newsletter would get printed and it would get stuffed into envelopes and sent out in this humongous like sacks of mail, and then the orders would come rolling in off faxes, and we'd go and collect the post, and it would just be absolutely stuffed with orders and things. So it really was, it was an incredible time. And Peter was he had a real eye for what was a great wine that, I guess I don't know if mass market is the right word, but, a really good eye for a deal, like whether it might be parallel imported champagne. He was a very sort of early person who did stuff like that, or emerging clean skins, which are everywhere now, but that was quite a new thing at Scenic Cellars, but also, just a really good deal. And he also used to sort of pick up stuff. Like one year we had a clean skin that was a blend of Chardonnay and Gewürztraminer from when some poor cellar hand had pumped over the wrong tank. And it was it was a fun little wine. So, there were all sorts of things there. And, we'd put out the special and it would just go romping out the door. So it was an amazing part of the trade, I guess, to see not only new and exciting things coming through, or young kind of new labels and stuff for people who were getting vineyards established here, but also, there would be lots of stuff that was always coming in from overseas. Again, the established labels, but Peter was always really open to, if any of us as staff had spotted something that we thought was worth having, or could be something that was a real up and coming sort of label to watch. And he was really open minded about lots of things. Like John Orr, who was a good workmate of mine there, he and I persuaded Peter to buy Nicolas Jolie's wines from the Loire. And you can see Peter was a little bit sceptical about, kind of, they looked a bit avant-garde, but he was, we made a case for it. And he was like, rightio, put in an order for some cases. And I suspect probably John and I bought and drank most of them. But there were people who would come in and say, oh my God, I can't believe you got that. And you've got to remember, Taupo is a little place. So it was a surprise for some people, I think, to walk in the door and suddenly find that there were just all these incredible wines from around the world. Just there. I think, one of the things, like I said, Peter was a very generous boss in terms of wine, and we used to have, amazing staff parties. Oh my God. Yeah. Some of them were pretty un-PC, but they were hilarious and a lot of fun. And, we just opened incredibly all sorts of great stuff. End up with all these old Armagnacs and cigars at the end of the night. But he was, he and Colleen, his wife, just the Taylors are a fantastic family, and Peter and Colleen were a wonderful team, and great kids, and so we used to have a lot of stuff around at Peter and Colleen's places, and at Peter and Colleen's house, dinners and lunches and things. And Colleen's a phenomenal cook, which was a great combination, and these were obviously quite long long staff parties. But even after Peter retired, I went to lunch several times with Peter and Colleen and groups of people, and often those lunches turned into the kind of early hours of evening and things, which was good fun in its own right. But Peter was, he wasn't just all about work. I mean, as I said, he wasn't a workaholic per se, because he had lots of other things going on in his life, but he was there early and worked really hard all day. But as many people know, he was also a really keen triathlete and competed in numerous Ironmen all around the world. And he was also really encouraging of staff getting involved in things. And if you wanted to get fit, like, he paid for us all to have gym memberships, which was also a wonderful support. The gym that he did that for was an ex-staff member who'd set one up, and he wanted to support her, but also encourage all of us to keep fit and have balance, which is a pretty good thing in the wine trade, really, where it can be easy to overindulge. If you wanted to have gym membership, he would pay for the first 6 months, and then if you kept it going, that was up to you. But also he would always pay for our entries for things like the Taupo Half Marathon and other events, and is to run, kind of as Scenic Cellars. We'd wear a Scenic Cellars t-shirt and stuff, and that is, I was always kind of interested in running, but never thought of running half marathons or anything like that. And because of his encouragement and support, and get out there and do it, Emma, I did, which was fantastic, because that kind of, I guess, sparked a love of trail running, which I have to this day, and I've done lots of really cool stuff with that. And so I can credit that to Peter as well. He was he was really, now that not that I was unaware of that, but looking back, I kind of think probably two of the great pleasures I have in life I can thank Peter for, which was the encouragement of that, as well as wine. And there's no question that he changed the trajectory of my life in terms of, I would have probably ended up in a science lab somewhere, which would be great, and I'm still interested in that type of thing, but I've probably had a far more fun life as a result, working in wine. And I think there's absolutely no chance I would have embarked upon doing a Master of Wine if I hadn't been at Scenic Cellars, both from the encouragement, that I got from Peter just to, get on and work hard and do things like that, but also the support, with the amount of wine that was available. He was happy for me to run tastings and do stuff, which was really helpful for me for exposure for what I needed to taste. And he introduced me to Bob Campbell and said, well, if you want to keep learning about wine, this is the way to do it. Which is funny. I don't think I quite realised what I was biting off when I got going on that, but I'm really pleased I did. But there was really, for me anyway, doing a Master of Wine in a small town in New Zealand, there was absolutely no better place to be starting off doing that than working at Scenic Cellars. So yes, I've probably waffled on a bit too much, but Peter was a really remarkable man. He was a sort of a larger than life character in many ways, even though he wasn't a big brash sort of a person, but he had a really strong personality, and he was just always Peter, no matter what setting he was in or where he was in the world or what he was doing. He was a really authentic person, a genuine person. As I said, a hard person in some ways, because he was, he could be pretty black and white and uncompromising about things, but he just had this amazing generosity of spirit and a great sense of humor. He was a really important presence in my life. He was a really impressive person with what he did in the wine trade, and there's a real legacy there, I think. And it's so wonderful just to have this opportunity to talk about him, because I also think there's an element of like that sense of an end of an era. I mean, in some ways, I still find it hard to believe that he's gone, because he was such an amazing sort of personality and presence, and I think and he had such energy and joy for life and things that I kind of felt like in some ways Peter would always be there. So yeah, it still makes me really sad that he's not, that there's places I go that I would hope to still see him, and he's not there. But he lives on, and certainly in many of our memories, and there will be a lot of amazing Peter stories around the place, people that know him. But yeah, it is the kind of the end of an era too. The memories of what the New Zealand wine trade was like back then sort of slowly go with the passing of people like Peter and others. So I hope that those of us who are still around, who remember that, keep that ethos, I guess, of just generosity and passion for wine for its own sake, not for it being expensive or fancy or being able to sold or showed off or anything like that, but just that pure pleasure of really great wine, and being able to share those wines with other people who feel like that about wine. That's probably the strongest kind of lesson that Peter imparted upon me, and it's one that I hope that I carry forward and share with others as well. So yeah, it's fantastic, Grant, that you're speaking about Peter and Scenic Cellars. I think they're both really important parts of New Zealand wine history, ones that I'm super grateful to be a part of, and I appreciate the chance to have had a wee a wee waffle about them. So thanks.
Just taking a quick pause in the episode to remind you to like, subscribe, comment, and come and follow me on socials too. So next we have Ian Isaac. So he was a former employee of Peter Taylor, and him, alongside two others, actually brought the business from Peter and took it to the next stage. And I've had the pleasure of obviously dealing with Ian as a customer of his, and then later as a as a purchaser, buying wines from Ian. And also for those long-time followers of the podcast will remember that Ian was part of the podcast way back, where he came on board and he was talking about wine judging and what happens with wine judging and how it all works. And so, now here's a little thing. He actually sent me an email with this, so I'm reading it verbatim from the email, just what he said in his words. So in the mid-1990s, he was managing a wine store in Ponsonby Road. Actually, we'll use him as the first person. My wife and I were keen to get out of the big smoke of Auckland, and we had family living in Taupo. I'd heard of the amazing wine shop in Topol called Scenic Cellars. And on the spur of the moment one day, phoned them to see if there was any jobs that were going. I spoke to Colleen Taylor, the wife of the owner, Peter Taylor. She was very friendly and said they may come back to me if anything came up. I didn't give it too much more thought after that. However, 2 to 3 weeks later, in a wine shop I was managing, a customer came in. I didn't know who Peter Taylor was or knew what he looked like, and started asking heaps of questions about wine, like he was testing me. He was in his 50s and had a fairly gruff demeanour. It's quite funny because that's how Peter Taylor comes across, but he wasn't actually that gruff. But clearly knew his wine. A few days later, after that, I was contacted and asked to go down to Scenic Cellars in Topol for a further interview chat. Several weeks later, after renting our house in Auckland, we moved down to Topol and I started working for Pete at Scenic Cellars. This was the beginning of 1996, in brackets this is 30 years ago. And at that time, Pete had already built up Scenic Cellars to be one of the best and well-known independently owned wine shops in New Zealand. The range of wines from New Zealand and imported from around the world, particularly France, was eye-watering. Many customers from that time will probably still recall how one had to literally crawl their way around the shop, as there was just so much wine all over the place. Pete was a huge champion of New Zealand wine. He was probably one of the first retailers to have winemakers' dinners. And there would be a good number of celebrated winemakers out there today who owe a lot to Pete, to what Pete did in supporting their early careers. Pete didn't suffer fools, and he drove a hard bargain with suppliers and producers, but he was always fair and honest. He could be a hard taskmaster, but never asked anybody to do anything he wouldn't do or already had done himself. Pete was very generous with staff parties and gatherings, with his wife Colleen cooking all the food and Pete supplying lots and lots of amazing wine for us to enjoy. You'll actually hear another story about that too. You have actually heard another story, I should say. Pete could certainly handle his wine and was always the one opening the shop the next day after these events, as most of us were in no fit state the next morning. The customers always came first, and I learned many things from Pete. He would drill into us such things as the importance of rounding off your job and not just leaving it to someone else to finish. Pete hated laziness in people and always kept himself busy in his personal as well as work life. A keen triathlete, Pete was one of the founders of Trisport Topol and went on to finish more than 10 Ironman races here in Topol. In brackets, see, Colleen could give you the exact number, Grant. It's probably closer to 20 actually. Yeah. He was a tough bugger and highly regarded in Topol. I had my fair share of run-ins with Pete, but to this day, I have a huge amount of respect for what he achieved and contributed to Topol and the New Zealand wine industry. I have many great memories and good times working for Pete in Scenic Cellars. When Pete died, it was a private event, which is how he wanted it to be. Pete never liked being in the limelight, but as a testament to who he was and the legacy he left behind, should there have been a public funeral, the Great Lakes Centre in Taupo would have been overflowing all the way to the lakefront. And yes, I have to agree, if there was a public service for Pete, there would have been people everywhere. I mean, I remember when Bruce Grant, those of you who know Taupo and know the local wine scene here, there was the merchant of Taupo, now that owns Scenic Cellars, was set up by Bruce Grant. And while he wasn't really a rival, he was a rival in some sense. Independently owner-operated, sold wine, he had the deli foods and stuff like this. And yeah, when he passed, the Great Lakes Centre, I was standing outside. I couldn't even see the stage or anything because there were so many people. And so if Bruce Grant had that many people, Peter Taylor would have had more. Anyway, yeah, beautiful words from Ian, and no, what can you say? And same with Emma, you know, it's interesting the reflection of the two. You know, you heard what Emma had to say, and it was reflected with what Ian had to say. They so much love and admiration, but he was a hard taskmaster, and he wanted the best. You know, he wanted the best out of all his staff. So it's very admirable.
Just taking a quick pause in the episode to remind you to like, subscribe, comment, and come and follow me on socials too.
Next up, we have Daniel Kemp. So Daniel Kemp, he used to own the Batch back in the 90s. He actually touches on this briefly in the clip that I'm going to play. He was actually a former employee of mine, and those of you who are long-time listeners, I credit him as the one who started me on my wine journey. So it's, you know, it's quite funny how, you know, Peter was his mentor, and in ways Daniel was mine. So, you know, it's nice to have that, you know, to have him contributing and to talk about that, because he's virtually followed the same path as Peter, although Peter was the trailblazer, but to have him, being an importer, selling wines and what have you, doing what Peter did is really cool to see, and so it's really nice to have him contribute. So yeah, here it comes.
Right, signing in, Daniel Kemp talking about Peter Taylor, the great Peter Taylor. Thank you for asking me to do this, Grant. I couldn't think of something more I'd love to do. He was a massive mentor and friend of mine. I certainly wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for him. Massive inspiration, guidance, so many things. Role model comes to mind, of course. From a very young age, actually, when I started falling in love with the wine industry, Scenic Cellars, of course, in the early days was the greatest shop in Australasia. Everybody knows it, that back then that was seriously into wine. We'd have people coming from all over the world to see the shop, as you know, Grant, and they used to come into my restaurant when I had the Batch restaurant back in those days. We're talking, 30 years ago now, I guess. There's many great stories. I remember Paul Pontilea, the general manager of Chateau Margaux, just one great story. There are many of them, coming into my restaurant with his son, actually. He's passed away recently. Sorry, Paul has think he passed away in 2016 from cancer, which is sad. But yeah, what a character. Yeah, he drove up in a silver Ghost Rolls Royce. I still remember it scraping on the drive as it drove up the drive there in Taupo at the Batch, and yeah, that was a funny story in itself. But he ended up spending a huge amount of money in my restaurant. He was opening up all my top champagnes, aged Dom Perignons and Krug, and some Petrus, 82 Petrus. I can't remember, but he spent about $8,000, just two of them. Back then that would be a lot more, and he tipped us $5,000. Can you believe that? He said it's, you know, one of the greatest meals he's ever had in this country, and he was quite blown away. And yeah, so there was a nice connection there. That's just one of the many stories from those days, you know, all riding off the back of the work. That magnificent shop. I still remember walking in there, and you could, back in the day, you could find all these gems on the floor, back vintages of, you know, not only Bordeaux and Burgundy, you know, the great Armand Rousseaus and DRCs, and, you know, Dujac. He was bringing all of that stuff in well before anyone else, cases of it, and he was selling them. It's remarkable. But yeah, I still remember, you know, you could walk in there and find these wines. You can't now. Of course, you know, everything's online, and, you know, you can search things worldwide, and, you know, those gems pretty much have disappeared now. It's hard to find them, of course. But that was a wonderful thing back in our day, and Scenic Cellars was one of those places that you could do that. So great memories for me. Yeah, he guided me in so many ways in the industry. As I said, I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for him. Yeah, starting great little vineyards and Kemp Wine Merchants 20 odd years ago. Started bringing in my own wines. Yeah, that's a lot of it's to do with Peter and my passion for wine. Working for the government as their consultant for many years, that as well. Even my fitness, you know, I think Peter did 13 Ironmen in the end. God, what a legend, you know. Yeah, massive role model. I was deeply sad when we lost him, of course, but I had been pre-warned by Peter, so luckily I was able to have a quick talk with him and send him a letter, which meant a lot to me, telling him how much of an influence he was on my life and what he did. I hope that's helpful, Grant. Thanks again for asking me to do this. Yeah, signing off, Daniel Kemp.
Just taking a quick pause in the episode to remind you to like, subscribe, comment, and come and follow me on socials too.
Now, the last contributor, which is no mean the least, is Tony Bish. Now, most of you will know him as the winemaker, owner of Tony Bish Wines, the Chardonnay specialist. And he is the architect behind the legendary Sacred Hill Rifleman's Chardonnay. So those of you who know that, then you'll know Tony Bish. Now, as far as winemaking experience goes, he started making wine when I was born. So, you know, he's done a lot, and he himself knows full well what it is like to sell wines to Peter Taylor. So this is what he wrote. Peter Taylor and Scenic Cellars Taupo were always synonymous with fine wine, strong personal relationships, and epic tastings. Peter had a remarkable energy, great clarity of thinking, and a superb palate. As his personal cellar recently auctioned a test, his love of wine was almost universal, with an extraordinary range of wine from the four corners of the earth, attesting to his breadth of knowledge, breadth and depth of knowledge, along with open-mindedness. All of this wrapped in a cloak of generous, impeccable manners. I'll start that again. All this wrapped up with a cloak of gentleness, impeccable manners, and legendary generosity. When presenting wines I had made during my time at Scenic Cellars to Peter, nothing was rushed. He always wanted to know more about the wine and the vineyard than any other merchant, reflecting his intellect and passion, and ever so quietly teasing out the full story. It was always a little I knew it was going to catch me out. Trepidatious, given his immense knowledge of the world of wine. And Peter always managed to make me relax after a few well-chosen words. He would not ever gild the lily, very much a straight shooter, and always delivered his verdicts with kindness. And when he really liked something, his eyes would light up, his energy was palpable, and genuine praise would fall like soft rain. And then he would open up something special from the cellar to extend the enjoyment of the moment and share in a wine from the other side of the world, usually. The tastings and events Peter held were indeed legendary and memorable. His organisation impeccable, his selection of wines intriguing, and his generosity always evident. He mentored and coached many a young winemaker and wine enthusiast alike. Our industry owes Peter a debt of appreciation for all he has done to spread the love and joy of all good wine with dignity, grace, and passion. Now, that last line really sums up why I wanted to do this, why I felt it was so important, and for me, goes to show why I think this is quite possibly the best episode I've done, because it's not about me. It's about a man that paved the way for so many of us in the industry, that helped so many in the industry and helped New Zealand get to where it is, because obviously, now it's a lot easier to get these foreign wines, but if you wanted to benchmark yourself as a winery against wines of the world, where did you go? You saw Peter. You saw Peter and you said, Peter, I've got this wine that I need to benchmark against this, that, and that. He had it. He had the wines that you needed to benchmark yourself against. So absolute pleasure to do this, and absolute pleasure to bring this to, again, no need, I feel, for a wine of the week, because this is not about me, and it's not about anything else apart from the legacy of Peter and just the general joy of wine. And so I hope you love this episode and that you share it with all that you know that enjoyed wine and had anything to do with Peter in any way, because the more, and also people that need to know about Peter, because the more people that do know, the better we are, that know how legendary he was. So thank you as always for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. I mean, I'm glad that I pre-read these or pre-viewed these, because it's been a very emotional journey to put this on. It's taken the best part of a month to put this together. So I hope you enjoyed the journey that I took you on here today, and that you can embrace and enjoy the legacy of Peter Taylor. Yeah. As I said, thank you as always for joining us. Sante Borak Yahuwah.